meeting is taking place. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm Jane Frances Kelly, Director of the Grattan Institute Cities Programme. And I'll also say just now, if you could switch off your mobiles or put them to silent or vibrate, whatever it is it does for you. It's a great pleasure to welcome Geoff Mulgan to this Grattan seminar, as well as being a former boss of mine, which I imagine is the top thing in the CV. Geoff is director of the Young Foundation, one of the world's leading centres for social innovation, social enterprise and public policy. The Foundation has a 50-year history of creating new organisations in the public, private and non-profit sector, as well as pioneering ideas in fields as varied as ageing, education, healthcare and poverty reduction. After 1997, Geoff spent 7 years in the British government, during which time he had roles including Director of the Government Strategy Unit and Head of Policy at 10 Downing Street. Before that, he was the founder and director of the think tank Demos. He's also been Chief Advisor to Gordon Brown, MP, a lecturer in telecommunications, an investment executive and a reporter on BBC TV and radio. He's a visiting professor at LSE, UCL, Melbourne University and the China Executive Leadership Academy, and a board member of the Work Foundation, among other organisations. He's worked with many governments around the world, ranging from China and New Zealand to Australia, Canada, France and Denmark, and has lectured in over 40 countries. He's in Australia this week to work with an ANSOC programme retreat for senior executives. His most recent book is The Art of Public Strategy, and previous publications include Good and Bad Power, The Ideals and Betrayal. Geoff, welcome. We're going to do this seminar in a kind of a Q&A format, aiming for a discussion up here on stage of around 40 minutes, leaving 20 minutes or so for questions. I'll also mention at this time that we're recording the event and that you will be able to access the recording on the Grattan website. Okay, so later this year the Grattan Institute will be kicking off a piece of work on cities and social interaction. And we realise there's a large body of evidence that humans need social interaction to flourish, and not least through working for Geoff earlier this decade. I had long noticed that such psychological needs were not given as much attention by policymakers as material needs, and that our economic selves are far better served by government than our psychological selves. In cities, one consequence of this is that at all spatial levels, from housing through street design, neighbourhoods, right up to city structure at the highest level, these needs are often not taken into account. And some kinds of urban design may actually be building in isolation with consequences for the quality of our lived experience and our mental health. And so we're going to be taking a look at those issues later on this year at Grattan. At a time when the largest growing household type is single-person households, our population is ageing, and members of society continue to experience disadvantage, this doesn't seem good enough. So when the opportunity arose to talk to Geoff about the work that the Young Foundation has been doing in the area of unmet needs, we jumped at it, and I will now gracefully transfer myself from here to there. So Geoff, the Young Foundation recently published a report called Sinking and Swimming, Understanding Britain's Unmet Needs, to a great deal of coverage. And as I noticed when you put it down just outside, it's also got a real thud factor to it. Indeed, one major newspaper editorial was headlined in praise of the Young Foundation in reaction to the report. Can you tell us about the genesis of the research and the methodology that you used?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and I'm glad to have brought some rain to your city.
That's why we have the bridge over.
This book is called Sinking and Swimming, so there's a water theme here this afternoon. What lay behind this piece of work, which came out in December, really began with our bookshelves of the Young Foundation. On one whole shelf is a collection of volumes which contain a remarkable study done at the end of the 19th century by a man called Charles Booth, who was a businessman who was convinced that claims about poverty in Victorian London were really overblown. And so he set out to research poverty to prove that in fact people were doing pretty well. And fairly quickly discovered this was not the case at all. And in an extraordinary series of studies, house by house, studying people's conditions, their income, whether they had enough food to eat, how much they were drinking. He essentially documented an appalling picture of abject need amidst the prosperity of a great city, then the richest city on earth. And about 50 years later, Michael Young, who's the origins of the Young Foundation, began a number of studies which attempted to look at poverty in mid-20th century with a man called Peter Townsend, who died last year, who was the sort of great founder of poverty studies in Britain. And out of that came all sorts of things like measures of how much food you needed to survive in one society, what income you needed, and that led to setting levels of income support, for example. And we felt the time was right to do something a bit similar, to sort of stand back and look at the patterns of needs across the country, partly because there had been a dozen years or so of quite intensive public policy on poverty and social exclusion, which I and others had been involved in. And we felt there was something new going on. So the method we used in this was really two or three things. One was quite statistically intensive, and there's a man called Klaus Moser who was involved right from the start, who's an extraordinary 86-year-old who was chief statistician in Britain in the 1960s, and as a sort of slightly iconic figure who's been chairman of every institution there is, from the British Museum to the Opera House to this, that and the other. And he was really passionate about getting to understand who was right at the bottom of society now, who was not being reached by government policy. So we did quite a lot of reanalysis of statistics, new surveys and so on, and also tried to design how in the future statistical officers should be trying to get under the surface of need. And that work coincided a bit with work which has been underway at the OECD for the last 5 years on trying to get the world's statistical officers better measuring what matters now in terms of societal progress, escaping from often misleading measures of GDP. The second element was a series of case studies, not just around us in East London, but looking at sort of the daily lives of people in the northeast of England, South Wales, Middle England, and doing in some ways classic ethnographic studies of life, and to see what came out through that lens. And then in a way we tried to pull those together to see what were the patterns emerging. And then finally we did quite a lot of almost classics of focus group work, seeing how did the public think about needs, which needs made a claim on the community or on society now, which ones mattered and which ones didn't. Anyway, it's all in there, and as you say, there's a lot of, in a sense, complexity and detail. In some ways it's quite a positive story of material needs being much better met now than even 10 years ago, let alone a century ago. Most people have enough to eat, most people have enough heating and light, most people have enough cash to get by, mobility and so on. But it paints a picture of, if anything, seriously worsening levels of psychological need, needs for care, for comfort, for love, all the things which are really hard for policymakers to